the title that I decided for this forum is The Poor in Spirit, and that comes from the Sermon on the Mount, and it's the first beatitude. And it goes, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And the way I got into this topic is I was reading Meister Eckhart, and I came across a teaching that goes something like, "Be free and empty as possible." And that got my attention because I really didn't know what emptiness means and how it would work in one's spiritual life. So a subtitle or an alternative title for this forum will be Fullness and Emptiness. And I'm going to try to answer three questions. I encourage you to interrupt me whenever you have a question, so that at least some of your needs will be met. The first question is, what does poverty of spirit mean? And alternatively, that could be, so what is emptiness? What does that mean? The second question is, why is it a blessing to be poor in spirit? And the third one is, in what ways is being full of spirit a blessing? Um, I'm going to come at this with a mostly perspective. I will probably borrow from Buddhism and a book by Jack Kornfield called The Wise Heart. I'll also come back to Meister Eckhart at points. I've stumbled across a Pentecostal Christian online named John Rittenball, and he has an online, it's called the Forerunner Commentary. And so I will tap into that some. And I've also stumbled across a book by Eknath Esrauren. I don't know how it's said, so we're just going to go with Eknath, who's an interesting fellow who essentially is teaching from a place of spiritual values, kind of a perennial approach. And finally, I'm going to tap into my experience as a Sufi. So this is going to be a kind of a shotgun approach, and I'm going to throw out a lot and see what sticks. Um, so let's start with the first question. What does poverty of spirit mean? And I have to be honest, I've always been puzzled by that phrase because from a Sufi perspective, or from most of my spiritual life, I've always thought that being spiritually rich is the goal and to be filled with spirit. And so I've been interested reading about poverty of spirit, and there there are a lot of overlapping ways of thinking about it. Um, the first way, and this comes from Meister Eckhart, is that it's really about detachment. And detachment can mean acceptance of what is. It can mean being in right relationship to what is. It also can mean being non-identified with what your experience is. So all of these have to do with um, being being filled with equanimity and peacefulness in relationship to whatever comes to you, both internally and externally. Um, Another way that most people think of poverty of spirit is simply as a humility or an absence of pride and arrogance. Um, there's also the notion that when you are poor in spirit, you're also in a state of powerlessness, that you feel like you don't have any power to control things, and that leads to a kind of a neediness for help from the divine. Um, Another way of thinking of it is it leads to a sense of nothingness, of being nothing. Or alternatively, a sense of spiritual bankruptcy, that you really don't know what spirit is, you don't know how it can help you. There's a kind of a sense of having to rely on that which is beyond the self. And finally, it's essentially a state of being free of ego and self. So that if you're poor in spirit, you don't have a lot of stuff going on inside that competes with being turned and reliant on God. So, any questions about what poverty of spirit, what view of poverty of spirit makes sense to you, or that you would like to learn more about?
I missed the very beginning of this, unfortunately, but it would help me to get the context for where the phrase is used, because that has a lot to do with what kind of interpretation I might make of it. So could you give some pictures of where this phrase comes into play and the meaning that it seems to have in those contexts?
There's mercy for the tardy. It comes from the Beatitudes, the first Beatitude, given on the Sermon on the Mount. In the Bible, it's Matthew book 5, verse 3. And it goes, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Any other questions before we move on? Just one other thing, Tobin. Alternatively, I could have titled this forum "Emptiness and Fullness." That essentially poverty of spirit, when you listen to Buddhists or read Buddhism, is often referred to as emptiness, whereas in the Christian tradition, that it goes back to the Beatitude for the most part. Melissa, you need to unmute.
Yeah, sorry. Is emptiness in this meaning a good thing, like being open to God, where your vessel is ready to be receiving the Spirit, or is it a negative?
In the spirit of this forum, it's a good thing.
Okay.
But when you see the word empty, it can be used in a lot of other ways, like bordering on depressed, or not having any, lacking meaning. But those are more psychological ways of thinking about it. I'm using it in the sense of that Buddhists use it, and as equivalent, as synonymous with poverty of spirit.
Thank you.
John, I see in some other translations, it's "Blessed are the humble," rather than "poor in spirit."
Yes. I think that, okay, so in those, okay, I've relied heavily on a book called Original Goodness by Eknath E. And he actually takes all the Beatitudes and tries to interpret them in a broad sort of cross-denomination, interreligious view. He has humility as the first Beatitude. I think humility is a good way to think of it, but it seems like it's used as a separate Beatitude. So I really can't help you much there, Steve.
I'm just commenting that one makes more sense to me than "poor of spirit."
poor of spirit is very ambiguous. So yes, sir, Howard.
Well, in the original, it is poor in spirit, and there would be a word for humility that isn't used there. So this is perhaps an editorializing on part of the translator to call it humility, which I think a lot of us would agree with. But and that ambiguity is there in the original too. I think poor in spirit is a very good literal translation that also translates the sense of kind of ambiguity and the surprisingness of the statement. So,
Thank you, Howard. Joe.
I was just reading some stuff, and I note that Luke has it, blessed are the poor, and Matthew adds in spirit, and that it has some parallels in the Old Testament, but not much. Doesn't seem like that concept of poor in spirit appears much outside of Matthew. In terms of who Luke was and who Matthew was, I don't know if that has some significance, but I think that in general, some of the interpretations I've heard has to do with simplicity of spirit. Poor not meaning impoverished or lacking, but poor meaning simple and humble perhaps, but not having a spirit that puts itself above God, that having a spirit that derives from God. And I don't know, it's always been a little strange to me, but that's what I get out of it.
So all I can tell you, Terry, is in Meister Eckhart, one of his famous sermons is about the poverty of spirit as it's used in Matthew, and so we're talking about 14th century mysticism in Germany, and I came across a book by an anonymous author who actually, the title of the book is The Poverty of Spirit, and he basically is taking Eckhart's work and just expanding on it. Now, why that would be the way mystics in the 14th century go about it, I can't say, but that's kind of where I'm coming from.
I think of the poor in spirit as being opposed to the money changers in the temple or the Pharisee who were filled with what they felt was the Spirit. And in this case, in the Beatitudes, Christ is talking about theirs is the kingdom of heaven, as opposed to Pharisees or money changers in the temple. I see the poor in spirit as being the diametrically opposed to those who see themselves as filled with spirit.
Well, it's certainly intended to not have anything to do with material or financial poverty. It's all about the spirit. So let's move on to our second question, or my second question, which is, why is it a blessing to be poor in spirit? And one answer would be, right from the Bible, which is, you will end up you will experience the kingdom of heaven. It'll be yours. And that's widely meant, at least in what I've been reading, to mean heaven on earth, or to experience joy, or from a Buddhist perspective, nirvana. It's like it's understood to mean when you're poor in spirit, you're free of that which competes with God. It's more likely that you'll experience joy, because joy is more possible when you're forgetting yourself, and you're absorbed in something other than small mind or ego. Um, so Gandhi, I didn't know this before I started doing some reading. Gandhi used to say frequently, "I am trying to reduce my spirit to zero." And so that's at least from my perspective, it's a helpful way to think about being poor in spirit. That you let go and you empty yourself of everything that gets in the way of knowing God or being in right relationship with God. Another way to think of it is it helps to let go of anything and everything that gets in the way of spirit with a capital S. So it's really, well, from a Buddhist point of view, it's really about letting be and letting go. And one of the things you want to let go of is that which is ego, or that which is self, or that which um, it distracts us from what is real and ultimate. Kelvin?
That brings to mind a memory that I can't pin down from one mystic, and I can't remember if it was a Christian mystic or more of an Eastern tradition, but saying that the path is to let go of everything, and the hardest thing to let go of is the love of God and the idea of God and that kind of connection. But to really exist without those attachments, even to God and the Spirit and all of the things we think of.
That is a very advanced teaching. And it's true. It's kind of like in Buddhism, you'll hear the teaching, if you meet the Buddha on the road, slay him. Another thing I probably should have mentioned earlier is this this idea of poverty of spirit is really coming from what's called an apophatic view of theology or mysticism. Apophatic meaning let go of all images. You can't know God directly, or you can, at best, you can know what God isn't. And that's contrasted with a cataphatic, which is confident that God can be known and that the truth can be said about him. And that's kind of what I've been getting from Sufism over the years. Any other questions about question number 2?
Just a question about what you just said. You said what you were getting from Sufism over the years. So have you been getting the apophatic view from them or the cataphatic view from the Sufis?
Almost completely the cataphatic view. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that when I get to the third question. But one of the things that got my interest in this notion of emptiness or poverty of spirit is that as Sufism was taught to me, and as even from the beginning of my meditation, it seemed to me the goal, and usually unstated, but the goal was to fill up with light and love or divine energies, or fill up with God as much as possible. And so this idea of emptying and being free of all images and free of all self-will was not something the Sufis were emphasizing. Now, since you asked, there is one exception, and that is in Sufism, there is a big theme having to do with what's called fana, which is usually translated as annihilation of the self. So in that sense, Sufism is about letting go of or abandoning or allowing the ego to die throughout the journey. And then there's a major station where there's a dramatic mystical experience of the self being annihilated and the sense of nothingness, and eventually you leave that and you end up in what's called baka, which is a kind of abiding in God all the time, a kind of closer union with God. So in that sense, yes, there is, and Sufis do tend to be ascetic and unworldly, but at least, and maybe it's just unique to me, that as my spiritual life unfolded, it seemed to me when I was praying, I was trying to fill up with spirit, fill up with light and love. So I hope that made some sense to you. Let's see, anything else I want to say about this? Here's a phrase from Cornfield from Buddhism, which that got my attention. The wise wander freely in this world, carrying only blessings. And that's not a bad way of thinking about enlightenment or nirvana. And so there's a sense from that notion, that teaching, that as one progresses spiritually, as one becomes more and more poor of spirit, then one is emptied more and more of anything other than the commitment to be blessing whatever is and bringing blessings to the world. And one last thing I want to say about this. I think that one of the most important things in my own experience has been learning to trust in God and rely on God. And that's hugely important and it reduces unnecessary suffering. Now, I've been spending some time with Buddhists online in Asheville, and every once in a while you hear them talk about trust in life, but they don't talk much about, well, how are you going to develop that trust and what does it mean? And so to me, there's some tension between Buddhism, which acknowledges that trust is important, but they don't provide much in the way of teachings of how to build trust. Tobin?
Not something you build, but something you discover when you get in the right spot.
That's interesting. All I can tell you, Tobin, is that before I became a Sufi, I came across this idea that trust and surrender are really important. And I found it a little easier to surrender, but I never had a clue as to how do I trust? How do I come to trust God? And the Sufis were very helpful with that. And I wish I could be more explicit about how that was cultivated, either indirectly, but by 4 years of being a Sufi, somehow that trust had been cultivated. And they call it tawakkul in Arabic, which means reliance on God. But in my experience, it was a faith built around two principles which are unprovable and take faith. And the two principles are, God is the only one who knows what's best for me and for everybody else and for the world. And second, God is the only one who knows what I really need. And therefore, it's important. If I can believe those things, I have found myself a lot happier and a lot less filled with despair or lack of hope or what the Buddhists call unnecessary suffering.
I want to go back to what Tobin said.
Please.
Which is discovering or finding something that's already there. And are you familiar with Eckhart Tolle?
Just by name.
Okay. Well, he talks about living in the moment, which is, it sounds like a catchphrase, or like people throw these things out, but it's really profound. It's letting go of of thoughts of the future and past, which is really hard to do. So all of a sudden there's this awareness in this that pervades everything. And it's like perhaps an experience of God. I mean, that's my interpretation of it, I guess. But so it's not like a journey to get there. It's just this thing that's there already in that just needs to be revealed. You know, it doesn't take years of practice or something. Anyway, I just thought I'd mention that because what Tobin said kind of sparked that for me.
Well, upon further review, it is true in many traditions that there is a basic assumption of the nobility or inherent goodness of the human being, the human spirit, the human soul. And in that sense, we are already always enlightened, but we may not be able to sense that in a real way, or so I guess going back to what Tobin was saying, the more we can have access to that nobility, or what I'm inclined to call our godlike nature, the happier and more faithfully we will live our lives. Any other comments before we go to question number 3?
I guess you know, I hadn't thought a lot about before this, you know, trust, surrender, together, but now, excuse me, now that I hear people talking about them, they all sort of mush together in my mind in a way that I can't quite explain, but I kind of intrigues me.
Yeah. To me, you have to, it seems important to take the whole phrase. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. I mean, theirs is the kingdom of God is really more about what we're getting. And what is this kingdom of God we're talking about? Being poor in spirit is a way of getting there, but and the notion of the kingdom of God, I think, in a way divides Christians a lot between those who think of the coming kingdom, the second coming, and those of us who believe that. When earlier in the chapter, he says the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He meant at hand, not 2,000 years later. It is a thing that is beyond time. And you open yourself up to whatever this kingdom of heaven is through being poor, as Luke says, or being poor in spirit. And I tend to associate poor less with impoverishment and more with simplicity.
It's a Quakerly way of thinking about it. So I will add that in several of the readings I've been doing, the kingdom of heaven is almost equated with the idea of living in eternity with a capital E. And I have to admit, I don't have any firsthand experience of that, so it's kind of a foreign notion to me. But if that helps anybody, so be it.
I guess one thing that unfortunately keeps coming to me during this conversation is I've just finished watching first season of a documentary series on HBO about this cult that really encouraged people to surrender, to empty themselves. Every time they started to push back, they'd say, "You're holding on to things. You're not trusting enough. You're holding to yourself. You need to release yourself." And when people did, they ended up just falling prey to people who wanted to exploit them in really horrible ways. And that the people who had some sense of self that they reached a point and they're just like, no, I'm not letting go of this. I am going to stay true to this in myself, and I'm going to leave. They're the people who were okay and who ended up finally exposing this whole basically criminal enterprise. So I guess I keep thinking about that as we hold up the virtue of surrender and trust, that these things can be make people very vulnerable to very terrible forms of exploitation.
That's
what
totally fascinating, James.
That's well said. As a matter of fact, when I was recently when I was with this Buddhist group in North Carolina, the teacher gave a talk on sense of self. And in contrast to mainstream Buddhism, her point was, if you're going to function in this world, you need to have a sense of self, and your ego needs to have good boundaries. So as I was listening to you, it seemed to me the question that is, what are you trusting, or who are you trusting, and to what or whom are you surrendering? And if you phrase it that way and are open to the notion that it's spirit or reality with a capital R, or the divine, or God, whatever you want to call it, then it's less of a problem, I think. But it's certainly true. There are a lot of cults and a lot of approaches that try to tear down the ego, but they often don't replace it with anything that's really better. So let's get to question number 3, which once again is, in what ways is it a blessing to be filled with spirit? Which has been my modus operandi until recently. It seems to me, okay, let me start off with one of my teachers, as I was becoming a Sufi, said, if you want to be generous, it helps to be rich. And I think he meant that both in a financial, but I took it more in a spiritual sense. So that if you want to be living with a generosity of spirit, it helps to have been filled with love and light, and to have developed or been given or somehow reach a state where you're more godlike. So from a Sufi perspective, which makes sense to me, or let me step back. To me, it's helpful to make a distinction between God as essence and God as energies. And that's a popular way of thinking about God within Eastern Orthodoxy, going back to St. Gregory of Palamas. But it's the same way in Sufism. And actually, when I first started meditating, my sense of what I was experiencing was energy more than anything else. So in Sufism, there's this idea that we can come to know and be transformed by God via divine qualities, or what has been called the 99 names of God. So it seems to me that's a very, very important aspect of growing spiritually, and one that makes sense of me when I am in an open, receptive mode of being touched by God, being touched by love and light. So let's hear it for fullness after all. Let me see anything else I want to say about that. So this, in Sufism as well as in Christianity and Judaism, there's this idea that we are created in the image of God. In the Quran, it says Adam was taught all the names of God. So in Sufism, that's taken to mean that we have inside all of God's qualities, but not with the intensity or the perfection that they are manifested directly from God. And so there's a way in which thinking of ourselves as having all of these qualities with a small q makes it, takes this idea of being godlike or godly to a more specific and workable place. So I found that very helpful in terms of coming to understand myself as a spiritual being more fully and deeply. So, Terry?
Oh, I'm waving at Kimberly. I am. Hello, Kimberly.
So, anyone want to ask any questions about this idea of fullness as it comes to me through Sufism? Tobin?
Just the thought occurred to me, in the Buddhist tradition, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, and it sort of dissolves the distinction between the two, and that there is a way in which they are not separate and distinct.
Yeah, I came across that in Jack Kornfield, and I haven't found it very helpful, but I hope it helps you, Tobin. The one thing that did help was this idea that nothing is permanent. And so out of the emptiness, out of free creation or whatever, out of an emptiness, so a form comes out and it exists, and then it doesn't last. It returns to the void, so to speak. That seems to me a lot of times when we get in trouble with attachment or we forget that it's impermanent and that it too shall pass away or return to God.
Or is this part of the idea? I'm just asking that, everything is generated out of emptiness. Everything comes out of emptiness. And maybe that even goes back to the original beatitude.
Well, certainly that's the way Buddhists look at it. And also Sufis, for that matter, that the idea is there's a void. From that void, God creates, and in the Quran it says God says be, and then something manifests, and then it has its own fate and destiny, and then dies away. Now, whether that comes from the Beatitudes, hard to say.
I was just sitting thinking about fullness of spirit as opposed to being poor in spirit, and those two in contrast with each other. And I'll call it this way, that the prize, quote unquote, for being poor in spirit is the kingdom of heaven. If I become full in spirit, does that mean I no longer have the kingdom of heaven? Is no longer available to me? So I wonder if poorness, being poor in spirit, is more a thought of, I recognize I am poor in spirit. I am seeking to be more filled, but I have to always be seeking, even if perhaps I'm being perceived as being full of spirit by others.
Well, it's certainly true. One theme that appeared in several of the things I've been reading is this idea when you're poor in spirit, there's a sense of spiritual bankruptcy. And in Sufism, it's a sense that I am poor and needy for Allah, which is considered in some circles as being more holy than being sensed with this, given the sense of beauty and bliss and rapture, because when you're poor in spirit, when you feel empty, when you feel needy, when you realize that you can't resolve the difficulty on your own, it's a natural response to turn towards God and to pray and to ask for God's help. And in that sense, it has more potential to move you closer to God or to purify or to heal than this sense of, oh, ain't life great? And thank you, God, but doesn't change anything. Other than increase the trust in God and surrender, but it's not as purifying or cleansing as the hard times, the dark night of the soul, the feeling constricted and really needing help and knowing that whatever help I've tried to do for myself just it simply wasn't enough. Don't know if that answers your response to you appropriately or not.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. The another thought or example along the same lines in my career, we had certain things. We had in Atlanta, there was a carving, a sculpture that said excellence. It was carved in this big piece of granite, but the E on the end was not finished. And so I wonder if poor in spirit is similar to that in, perhaps in this lifetime, we cannot achieve fullness of spirit. And we always have to maintain the fact that we're searching for that fullness, because it can't be completed. Once we say it's completed, we kind of stop at that point. Just a thought.
Yeah, I think it's true that fullness is always changing. And so it's always life or spirit that invites us to go further and to move closer to perfection. I guess one thing I do want to share, and this is a little bit subjective and personal on my part, but when I first started doing this reading and reflecting and meditating and praying, it did seem to me fullness and emptiness were really at odds with each other. It really was paradoxical. And I've come to the convincement that they're both possible and maybe not simultaneously, but insofar as they're simultaneous, then it's a really a step closer to perfection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's paradoxical and there's antithetical. And paradoxical means that living in those two places at the same time. And we talked earlier about the idea of living in eternity. And in fact, we do live in eternity, whether we think we do or not. There's that phrase that time is only a reflection of our nervous system trying to make sure everything doesn't happen at once. And we need that to live our lives and go through our lives. But yet, in fact, all the time, we're living in eternity. And Thomas Kelly, I wish I could quote this. He has this really interesting part of Testament of Devotion. It says, basically, you need to perfect the ability to live in two states at once. One part of you is doing all these mundane things and thinking about paying the bills and so, and somehow the other is with God. And this is the meaning of praying without ceasing. So maybe it's not achieving the state of living in eternity, but somehow coming to rest in the reality of you're living in eternity and you're living in a moment at the same time. And maybe that's what the whole kingdom of heaven thing is all about. And the way to achieve that understanding is to not fill yourself with so much thoughts and egotism that the feeling of living in eternity doesn't seep in.
Well said, Terry.
Is it as simple as just saying, in order to be filled up, you have to be empty?
That's a true statement, Howard. I'm not sure it's that simple, though.
I I think of it in terms of playing the violin, of course,
Yeah.
like everything else in my life. And I've had the experience of going out on the stage with my ego and then forgetting my ego and being open to what's happening and suddenly being filled with the magic of the music. And so I think of it as being, you have to be empty in order to be
Yeah.
filled.
Mozart is knocking at the door. Let him in.
And it's not just Mozart.
Yeah, I know.
I think this is really at the kernel. I think this is about if one can actually be aware of the present moment and let go of the past and future, one lets go of the attachments because they're rooted in either the past or the future. And then the ego goes away. Okay. It's exactly what Melissa's talking about. And we then are open to this interconnectedness with others and with God in this way that can't happen otherwise. So.
I will say, Sarah, that the idea of living in the here and now is very prevalent in Buddhism, and it is kind of one of the mini goals when you're meditating. And when I've tried to do it, it's extremely difficult because my mind and ego keep wanting to jump to the past or the future.
If I could indulge everyone, this brings to mind a short verse, part of a series of things, but came to me after doing, various meditations and readings, and it goes like this. I journey to the east, follow the four directions, raise my face to the heavens, I bow my head, prostrate my body, cross my legs, and uncross my fingers. How long will it take till I learn? When I am empty, every direction is home.
Guess I really appreciate this discussion. I guess I want to maybe stick up one more time for the ego and the sense of self. I guess, yeah, I mean, the description you're describing, Melissa, of that sort of state of flow where you sort of lose that sort of self-reflective type experience. I mean, I experience that as well, sometimes on stage and in other times. That state, unfortunately, can also describe, soldiers on a battlefield in the act of killing. They can lose that sense of self and be totally immersed in the moment. And that sort of loss of self then is also losing the ethics, and you're losing your sense of concern that you might be doing something really horrible and really wrong. People in massive crowds at like huge rallies, you experience that loss of self, but that can be a terrible thing and lead people in horrible ways. So I honestly, my view is that the sense of self is always going to be a bit of pain in our life, that we're always going to have this reflective edge that's going to worry about what we're doing and that we're going to not be completely satisfied with our lives. And that's probably a good thing, like that we have that sort of perpetual restlessness and perpetual sense of self that's there saying, maybe this isn't a good idea. Maybe this is wrong. Maybe what we're doing isn't what we should be doing. Like that we shouldn't be trying to get rid of that voice, but rather just accepting that it's there and that that bit of yourself that's not ever going to be resolved is the source of humanity and that keeps us from really going over the edge.
I would just like to, I know we shouldn't be arguing, but I don't think that, I mean, in relating it to dance or to playing the violin, you wouldn't have that experience if you hadn't been working to know how to do all those things. And so I think if you're working with intention to be with the good spirit rather than the bad spirit, that's part of it as well.
Mhm. Sort of be empty, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, I think we, says the wise old man, I think we fool ourselves to think we can get rid of ourselves and our ego that easily. And maybe better to look at some manifestation of ourself as an old friend who can be tiresome sometime. And you don't always want to take them as seriously as you might, but you also have your ethical self and your artistic self and your worshiping self. And, you know, maybe being empty is having these things in harmony rather than having these things be absent.
Well, I certainly agree. It's hard, if not impossible, to get rid of the ego. At best, we get moments of selflessness and transcendence where we feel touched by spirit or we're brought to our own divinity, but they're temporary at best. Because after we've having this peak experience, we've got to go back and deal with the world. So we're past time. James, should we move on?
Sure. Thank you so much, Don, for this has really been a wonderful, very interesting, wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Well, James, I'm here to please.